Welcome to How I Built My Fundraising Consultancy, the stories behind the people driving results in the nonprofit sector.
I have some clients who I'm basically their development staff, and they just say, you write it, we'll sign it. And they really just kind of let me do my thing. Other clients are much more hands-on. They want to see draft number 1, draft number 2, draft number 5, draft number 7. That's unusual. Most of the time when I give a draft to a client, it's a pretty solid, close to final version.
Elise Saltzberg is the owner of Saltzberg Consulting and is an expert at grants and shares the ins and outs of running a business focused on researching and writing grants in this episode.
A quick announcement. As a listener of the podcast, we are making the Engagement Fundraising audiobook available to you free of charge. Just go to imarketsmart.com/exclusive-podcast-offer. As a thank you for listening, we wanted to give everyone free access to Greg's Engagement Fundraising audiobook that you can get on Audible or Apple Books for $15. Once again, just visit imarketsmart.com/exclusive-podcast-offer. That's imarketsmart.com/exclusive-podcast-offer. Thanks for listening to the podcast, and we hope you enjoy Greg's book. Now, on to the episode. We're here today with Elise Saltzberg. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
First off, can you introduce yourself and what Saltzberg Consulting does?
Saltzberg Consulting is a fundraising consulting firm. I would say about 80% of what we do is grant related, either grant prospecting or grant writing, grant editing, grant reporting. The other 20% would be every other sort of fundraising, annual fund, major gifts. I tend not to do much with capital campaigns, and I also don't get involved too much with special events. If one of my clients wants to do an event, let's throw a party. I usually refer them to someone else.
Yeah. Is the decision not to work with capital campaigns just because it is such a monumental endeavor to undertake?
There are just other consulting firms out there. That's their thing. That's what they do. And I let them do their thing and they let me do my thing.
Yeah. So what inspired you to start your business almost 20 years ago?
I had been working at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C., and I live in Baltimore, so I was taking the MARC train down to D.C., and commute was kind of getting to me. I had little kids, and after a while, I just couldn't do the commuting anymore. So I was a stay-home mommy for a while, and then I decided it was time to go back to work. I knew I didn't want to go back to Washington, so I started my own consulting practice primarily so I could also be a mom at the same time. And it worked out really well because now my commute is from the upstairs of my house to the downstairs of my house.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, I'm very familiar with the MARC train. I've taken it many times from the airport back to home in DC where I'm based out of. So one question I have is, what is your kind of time split between on-site at clients' offices versus where you're able to work out of your house?
Almost all of my work is done from home. I have a home office that's got everything that you could imagine. I have a couple of clients. I've never actually met them in person between email and phone calls, and there's never been a reason to meet them in person. I would say that at least once a week I like to get out of the house, either go meet with a client or a prospective client or a colleague, just sit and talk shop.
Yeah. And do you find most of your clients are kind of locally based, or do you try to branch out to other parts of the country?
Most of my clients are here in Maryland. I have a couple who are outside of Maryland. Within Maryland, it's primarily Baltimore County and Baltimore City. I have a few in Prince George's County. I have somebody in Hagerstown, but mostly it's local.
Okay. And you mentioned grants was a big part of what your consultancy does. Where did your initial interest in that kind of work come from?
I figured out that my first grant I wrote in 1981. I know I'm dating myself. I was living in Anderson, Indiana, and I was the executive director of an organization called Women's Alternatives. As part of the job of an executive director, I was doing a lot of fundraising, and the grant writing part of it came very easily to me. My mother's a high school English teacher, so I learned how to write that was where I found my most success. In subsequent jobs, I always leaned towards that part of the fundraising. My primary job at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, nearly all the funding at that time came from foundations. And so grant writing was a big part of what I did.
Yeah. Now, something I noticed in your background was in college you studied psychology. Did that have any kind of influence on your perspective for the work you do in fundraising?
It was actually animal behavior. I was in experimental psychology.
Yeah.
I wasn't counseling that much or analyzing people or anything like that. I worked with rats and mice in the lab. What I do now isn't directly related to that, but I learned science and I learned how to be a critical thinker.
Yeah.
That was certainly would help anybody in any part of their life in the future.
How'd you decide that you wanted to actually start working for nonprofits and do fundraising work?
I kind of fell into it. I was in grad school at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. I left the school, as I said, I was working with rats and mice. It was bothering me because I felt like we were kind of torturing these animals, not so much in my lab, but in the labs next to me. They had cats and dogs and chimpanzees, and they were planting electrodes in their brains and doing all kinds of things that I thought were just terrible. In my lab, the only thing that we did was starve the animals because we had to keep them on 80% body weight to get them to perform the behaviors that we were training them in. I would go in on the weekends and feed the pigeons and feed the rats. And so Monday mornings, everybody's experiments were all messed up. But anyway, I did that for a year and I just couldn't do it anymore. I left Bloomington. I was married at that time. My husband got a job in Terre Haute, Indiana, and then I lived in Anderson, Indiana. In Anderson, I was a counselor at Women's Alternatives, as I mentioned. It was a shelter for battered women and their children, and we had services for rape crisis survivors. So I was a counselor for 3 years, and then the executive director was leaving, and the board asked me to apply for the executive director position. As part of the interview, they asked me, well, do you know how to raise money? Do you know how to write grants? And I was, oh, yeah, sure, I can do that. They hired me as the executive director, and I found out pretty quickly that a big part of the job of that type of an executive director for that type of an agency, the big part of the job is raising money. And that was the part that I really liked the best. I was really good at it. And so every job I've had since then has always been a fundraising position.
What aspects of fundraising do you really enjoy?
Certainly, building relationships with donors is a big part of fundraising. It's something that some organizations don't really understand. I do sometimes get a client or a prospective client will call me. They'll say, well, can you write a template grant for us that we can send around to a bunch of different foundations? No, I won't do that because every funder is different and you have to talk to them first and build a relationship before you just blind send in a bunch of grant applications.
Yeah, it's like applying for a job and their cover letter, it's very obvious you don't know anything about the company you're applying for.
Exactly.
What was it like transitioning from a very local nonprofit in Indiana to a much more, national organizations like Friends of the Earth? Was it much different in that, scale?
Well, the scale certainly, our annual budget at Women's Alternatives was about $1.6 million, I think. Friends of the Earth, we were raising that amount of money, and at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities at that time, when I left, we were about $4 million annual budget. Now it's probably $40 million annual budget. Actually, at Women's Alternatives, I think it was about $160,000 was about the annual budget. So it was a big jump.
Did the work you did that feel different with the scale being so much different, or did it feel kind of the same, just different numbers you're looking to achieve?
It was definitely different. At the Center on Budget, you're dealing with the big boys. We would be talking to the people at the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, and the board of directors was and still is a nationally recognized board with really, really incredible, wonderful people on it. Not to knock Women's Alternatives, but the board was, nice local people who wanted to help these families.
Yeah.
It's just on a different level.
So your business now has grown to include 6 other consultants. When did you start expanding, and what roles did you see that needed kind of filled at the very beginning of that expansion?
When I started out in 2000 as a sole proprietorship, And I had a few clients. My first client was the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I think that's true for a lot of consultants. The first client of the consultancy is your former employer. I grew from there, and I grew to the point where I really had more work than I could do myself. I had a friend who was available and it kind of fell into it. She's still one of my associates. The associates do primarily the grant writing, and I'm doing more now grant editing than I am doing writing, which is fine with me and it's fine with them. I have very strong writers on my team. Occasionally, I would say they work directly with a client. Most of the time, it comes through me and still Saltzberg Consulting because my name is on it and I'm pretty tight quality control on what the finished product.
So in the grant writing, I'd imagine there's quite a bit of research involved in drafting those up, and those 6 consultants are doing that work as well during that writing process?
Well, we have a saying in the field, if you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. Every foundation is different. They all have their own special challenges. Some of the grant applications are online. I would say at this point, the majority are online portals. It's sort of like filling out the common grant application for college applications. Some of the formats are very tight. They'll have, 800 characters, supposed to write, your mission statement, your vision statement, your organizational history, and what you're proposing to do now, and all in 1,000 characters or in 200 words or something like that. It's very tough. Other ones are more open-ended and you can write as much as you want. Some foundations are still not online and they're doing paper applications. Some want you to submit, 11 copies so that they can give them to their 11 board members, and you have to make copies and bring it to them. It's still the old-fashioned way. You have to give them what they want, and that's part of the deal is that they're the ones with the money, and if they say they want 11 copies, you have to make 11 copies. The part that's a little bit frustrating, though, is when they also at the same time say they really want you to keep your administrative costs low, like zero. Well, somebody's got to go to Kinko's and make those 11 copies, and somebody's got, that costs 15 cents a page or whatever it is, and that's part of administrative costs. So don't tell me at the same time that you're not going to pay for administrative costs.
How has the business changed since year 1 and 2? Is it just you have more volume of work and you're not doing the original writing, you're now editing? Is that the main difference?
I'm still the one who has the primary contact with the clients. I usually have 10 to 12 clients going at a time. I have some clients who I'm basically their development staff, and they just say, you write it, we'll sign it. And they really just kind of let me do my thing. Other clients are much more hands-on. They want to see draft number 1, draft number 2, draft number 5, draft number 7. That's unusual. Most of the time when I give a draft to a client, it's a pretty solid, close to final version. I'll use little comment boxes in the margin or yellow highlighting to say, look at that section on page 3. That's the part that you really need to focus on. That's what they'll focus on, and the rest of it, they might look at it, they might not.
Yeah. And what's your marketing approach to gain new business, and do you target any specific verticals in the nonprofit sector?
I have education, housing, community development, disabilities, just about every category that you can have out there, I have in my portfolio. If I had to say what my sweet spot is, it's more based on their annual budget. Most of my clients are in the range of about $500,000 annual budget up to about $4 to $5 million. If they have a bigger budget than that, they don't really need me. They have their own development department. They have their own development staff. Although I do have some large clients, and they use me when their own staff capacity is at capacity and they need extra help. And clients who are smaller than about $500,000 a year annual budget, they need my help. They really could use my help, but they sometimes don't have the money to pay me. I like clients who can pay. So I tend to go for the clients that have the budget and have the capacity to pay me. When you're going after foundation grants or government grants, if you're a really small organization, with 1 or 2 staff people, the reality is that you're not going to be competitive with most grant applications. They just want to see that you've got the infrastructure to do whatever it is that you're proposing to do, a lot of foundations are leery of going for a really small organization that just doesn't have the capacity, or that's an all-volunteer organization.
Yeah. I was exploring your website and noticed that you have this "Are you ready to apply for a grant" page. Has that been a useful tool for gaining new business?
It is an amazingly useful tool. It's not a tool for getting new clients. It's a tool for not getting new clients.
Oh, it's like a filter.
Exactly. If somebody calls me and I can tell within, a 10 or 15 minutes phone call that they're not ready, what I'll do is I'll send them to my website and have them go through that little checklist and come back when you're ready, because it's a waste of my time and their money if they really don't have the things in place that you need to apply for grant funding. Do you have a program? Do you have a way of measuring your outcomes? Do you have a board of directors? Do you have a 501c3? All of these things are necessary. Well, by the way, if you don't have a 501c3, you can always get a fiscal sponsor. So I don't want to leave the impression that you're not ready if you don't have a 501c3, because that's not true. You do need to have a real program, and you really need to have a plan for operating your program and measuring your program's impact. If you don't have all those things, it's just not going to be a good fit for you to go apply for grants.
Yeah. Now, is there any hard lessons you learned in the first couple of years that if you're doing it again, that you'd take those lessons and do it from day one?
Just to not bite off more than I can chew. At the beginning, I was very reluctant to bring in associates. I just wanted to do everything myself. I had this idea that it wasn't right to make money off of other people's labor. That's the anti-capitalist part of me. But I have overcome that. In the first couple of years, that was definitely an issue for me.
And do you have any favorite tools you use in the grant writing process, whether it's research or the actual writing?
Well, for the research, GuideStar is about the best thing out there. We look up 990s on GuideStar and see who's on the board. We see who they're giving money to. We see what size of grants they're giving. And you can do a lot of good grant research from GuideStar.
And do you end up putting that information in some kind of repository, an application that kind of organizes that, so when you're actually doing the writing, you can reference that more easily?
If I have a client who wants grant research, I usually give them the information in an Excel spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm.
It'll have a series of columns, and the information comes from the Foundation Center. It'll come from Grant Station, was another good one, from GuideStar, as I mentioned. The first column will be the name of the foundation, the contact information, address, phone number, email addresses. The next column will be the areas of interest, what types of grants they're interested in. Say if it's an education one, are they K through 12? Are they focused on girls' education? Are they focused on STEM education? The next column will be the range of grants that they give. Is this a $10,000 foundation? Is this a $50,000 foundation? Is this a $500,000 foundation? The next column will be about the process of how to apply. Do they have a deadline? Do they have multiple deadlines? Do they have an online application versus they want you to do an LOI first? Other times they want you to just send in a full proposal right away. And then the last column is just any other notes that might be relevant. I'll put together the spreadsheet like this. I'll go over it with the client. There might be 25 or 30 different foundations, which is just too many to focus on at one time. So we'll pick out the top 5 or the top 6 and say, okay, these are going to be our priorities for this next 6 months. We're going to focus on these 5 or these 6. And how we make that prioritization will depend sometimes on the deadlines. If there's one that's got a once-a-year deadline of March 1st, well, in February, that's the one we're going to be working on. Sometimes it'll be because there's a relationship. The funder is known to the client, or they say, oh, they look at the board list, say, oh, I know so-and-so on the board. I can call him or I can call her. Right away, that one becomes one of the 6 priority funders. And then just if it's a good match, if you look at what they say they want to fund and that's what you want to do, that's golden. That's what you're really looking for is a good match between what the funder says they want to fund and what you're doing.
This episode is brought to you by us here at MarketSmart and Engagement Fundraising by Greg Warner. In this quick break, I want to remind everyone to go to imarketsmart.com/exclusive-podcast-offer to download the Engagement Fundraising audiobook for free. This offer is only available to listeners of the podcast. It's our way of saying thank you for listening, and we really hope you enjoy the book. Once again, go to imarketsmart.com/exclusive-podcast-offer to take advantage of this promotion, available only to listeners of the podcast. Now, back to the episode. So with that, let's get to the lightning round, just a series of quick questions and answers. What's the best piece of business advice you've ever received?
From somebody at University of Maryland. His name is Rob Sheehan. He talks about the VUCA world, VUCA, and it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. This is the world that we live in, and this is what you have to think about all the time, is how everything's changing, everything's confusing, everything's ambiguous. You have to be flexible and be able to deal with uncertainty and complexity. Sometimes it's hard.
What book would you recommend to those getting started?
The best book for somebody who wants to get into the consulting world the name is Alan Weiss, Weiss, and he has written a bunch of books. The title is $1 Million Consulting. Every page, there's something in that book that's useful information for consultants. It's been my Bible, my go-to book.
And do you have a favorite personal productivity habit?
To figure out what time of the day is the best time for you. I'm most productive in the mornings. So I try and not schedule meetings in the mornings because that's my work time. I'll schedule a meeting for lunch or in the afternoon when I'm sort of fading. At that point, I can get my best work done. 7 a.m. till 10:30 or 11 in the morning is my peak productivity time.
Do you have a favorite subscription you're signed up for?
A blog called Nonprofit AF.
What's one of your most important passions outside of work?
It's my family, my kids is my first priority, and second is fundraising. I do a lot of volunteer fundraising in addition to work fundraising.
What's the most common error you see nonprofits make?
It would be kind of what we talked about earlier, just willy-nilly sending out grant proposals to everybody they can think of without actually researching or trying to build the relationship first. It's generally not going to be successful to just random send out proposals.
And where can people find more information about your services?
Well, on my website, which is saltzbergconsulting.com, SALTZBERG Consulting. There's a phone number there as well. I'm happy to talk to people on the phone. I love talking about fundraising. It's my favorite topic.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today, Elise. It's been great chatting with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of How I Built My Fundraising Consultancy, presented by MarketSmart. If you like the show, make sure to review it in Apple Podcasts and pass it along to a colleague.
I also wanted to remind everyone to visit imarketsmart.com/exclusive-podcast-offer to download the Engagement Fundraising audiobook for free. Once again, that's imarketsmart.com/exclusive-podcast-offer.
Thanks for listening.